Hi, I'm Walt Wheeler, Executive Director of the Michigan Masonic Charitable Foundation, and we're here today recording another segment in our Legacy series, recordings and interviews with past Grand Masters of the Grand Lodge of Michigan. With us here today is Most Worshipful Brother Robert G. Helmic, Grand Master in 2004 and 2005. Bob, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us here today. We're going to start at the very beginning. Tell us where you were born.
Well, I was born in Lansing, Michigan, May 28th, 1939.
And tell me a little bit about your parents.
Well, my mother's name was Agnes, and my father's name was Robert. His middle name was Canada, which I always thought was kind of interesting. And my parents, we lived on the east side of Lansing, and when I was about 6 years old, they were divorced, and my mother and I went to live with my grandparents on the south side of Lansing. So I've never gotten very far from Lansing and lived in Lansing my whole life. But so my grandparents were like surrogate parents also. So
what were their names?
George and Georgina, and they were both from Scotland, from Aberdeen, Scotland, and they were known by their Scottish friends as Dode and Dode. So I think that must have been the nickname for people whose names were George. So,
did you have any siblings?
I have a half brother who is from my father and his second wife. So, and he lives in Colorado Springs.
Okay. So, any childhood memories? Anything stick in your mind about growing up?
Well, I remember changing schools, like from Foster Street School to Barnes Avenue School, which was in the elementary school, and that was a big change when you're 6, 7 years old. So I remember a couple playground bullies. I remember learning to deal with that because I was one of the smaller kids, and you could tell I wasn't much of a fighter. So, and I remember junior high school. Well, the one thing I remember was I wanted to be an engineer, and my 9th grade algebra teacher asked me at one time what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to be an engineer, and she says, "Bob, you'll never be an engineer."
What kind of engineering did you want to do?
Well, I thought automotive or civil engineering, yeah, but that wasn't to be.
So tell us about the schools that you went to. Start with grade school and work your way through.
Well, like I said, I went to Foster Elementary and Barnes Avenue Elementary, Walter French Junior High School, and Sexton High School. And I graduated in 1957 from Sexton High School.
So Walter French was also a Mason.
Yes, he was.
I didn't realize there was a school named after him.
Yeah.
When you were in school, what kind of activities did you participate in? Were you in band or sports or?
Well, I'm not very musical, and my mother, who was quite an athlete, and my father too, I think were kind of disappointed in me in that regard, because I tried to play baseball, but that was the best. I tried out for the golf team and never made the golf team, so sports weren't my thing, but I was editor of the high school yearbook my senior year, so that was probably, and I was on a couple committees for the dances, like the senior prom and the junior, what they called the J-Hop, back at those times. I don't know if they even have those dances anymore.
I know in your youth you were a member of the Order of Demolay. How did you find out about Demolay?
Well, a friend of mine in the 9th grade had just joined Demolay, and so he asked me to join, and that was like in the spring of 1954. So by the time all my petition went in and it was voted on, I joined in the fall, like in September. And then during that summer, I asked my grandfather, what he thought of Demolay, because my grandfather was a Mason. And he said, well, I don't know too much about Demolay, but if it's sponsored by the Masons, it must be a good thing. So I joined.
So were you active in Demolay?
I was quite active in Demolay. My first office was the 6th preceptor, And then I was the senior deacon, or the orator, and then the senior deacon. And then I went on through the lines to be master counselor my freshman year in college.
Very good.
Now, that was 1957, and I think most people would agree that masonry, in Michigan anyway, that was the high water mark of masonry and DeMolay. At that time, there were nearly 100 chapters of DeMolay in Michigan.
Wow.
So,
You mentioned you were in college when you were master counselor. Where did you go to college?
well, I started out at General Motors Institute. Oldsmobile was my sponsoring plant, and again, I thought I was going to be an engineer, and it just didn't work out. At about the end of my first year, I got a kind of a polite letter from Oldsmobile division saying, "You're not quite up to our standards, you need to work a little harder." And that whole summer, I thought to myself, maybe this isn't what I ought to be. And I've always liked to draw, and I liked being outside and working with my hands outside. And so I looked at Michigan State University, and they had a course in landscape architecture. And I said, that sounds like that's more down my alley. So I transferred to Michigan State and graduated in landscape architecture.
Very good. You served in the military?
I was in the National Guard. A DeMolay friend of mine, about the time I was graduating from college, he was in the insurance business, and he wanted to sell me some insurance. And at that time, he asked me what my military plans were. That was 1962. And I said, well, I guess I would wait for my number to come up in the draft. And he says, well, why don't you join the National Guard? And so I did, and I spent 6 months in active duty and 6.5 years in the active reserve.
Oh, very good. Where did you go?
Well, I started out in Fort Knox, Kentucky. Took my basic training there. And the last 4 months was in Columbia, South Carolina at Fort Jackson.
Okay. So after the military, you came back to Michigan, and what happened then?
Well, I had already actually had taken a job with the City of Lansing. It didn't hurt probably that the head of the Parks and Forestry Department for the City of Lansing was my former Sunday school teacher in the 5th and 6th grade. I had worked summers on Groesbeck Golf Course, raking sand traps, mowing greens, mowing fairways, that kind of thing. So I had worked 2 summers there. So when I graduated, I got a job with the City of Lansing, and then about 6 months into my first working period there, I took my 6 months of National Guard, and then went back and worked there for 3 more years.
And where did you go from there?
To the Department of Natural Resources. The person whose job I took with the City of Lansing went to work for the Parks Division of the Department of Conservation. And 3 years later, he called me and said, someone's leaving our department. Would you be interested in coming to work? And Ann and I had been married for about 2 years, and she said, I don't want you changing jobs every couple of years. So I said, I think I'll stay I'm sure that it'll work out, and I'll stay with the Department of Conservation, which later became the Department of Natural Resources.
So what exactly did you do at the DNR?
Well, I was the landscape architect, and I started out in the design section and eventually became in charge of what was called the development planning section. And so I designed campgrounds and parking lots and selected places for beaches, designed road layouts, and just in general designed state parks. I mean, some state parks were brand new, some were older parks that needed an addition. Warren Dunes was one of the parks I worked on first, and I designed the 2 campgrounds that are back off the lake shore there.
How long were you with the DNR?
32 years, almost 33. So
And that's where you retired from?
that's where I retired.
Okay. You mentioned Ann. How did you first meet Ann?
Well, that was the De Molay Job's Daughters connection. A friend, the first time I met Ann, she may not remember this, but it was at a swimming pool, a backyard swimming pool a friend had, and so he had a pool party, and he had invited some Job's Daughters, and I think if I remember right, his sister was in Job's Daughters, so Ann was there, and so I don't know that we officially met there, but that's where I saw her the first time.
You noticed her at the pool party. Okay, so where did you officially meet?
Well, we might have officially met at a Job's Daughters installation in Elma, if I remember correctly. She was on the other side of the room, and I was a little older. And with the De Molay boys that were there, they kind of dared me to ask her out on a date, so I did.
And obviously that relationship blossomed, and how much later then before you asked her to marry you?
Well, let's see. That was the first time we dated. She was like a junior in high school.
So you had to wait a couple years.
So we got engaged at the end of her freshman year, if I remember right, in college, that fall.
And you got married when?
We were married, this is a test, June 16th, 1964.
Very good. And I know that you have a couple of children. You want to tell us about your children?
We have a daughter, Robin, and a son, Scott, and they're both married. Robin works for the Grand Rapids school system. She's a special education teacher. Her husband works for Herman Miller in Zeeland or Grand Rapids. I think that the factory is in Zeeland, if I remember correctly.
I think so.
They live in Hamilton, just south of Holland. Our son is married, and his wife works for the state. He works for Delta Airlines and the Michigan State High School Athletic Association.
Very good. I know you have several grandchildren. You want to tell us a little bit about your grandchildren?
Well, Scott and Peggy have 4. The oldest is 19, and he's in his second year this fall of at Lansing Community College. The second one is Jordan, and he is, I think, a senior this year. And then there's Jory, and she's 12, and Julian is 9. I think I have the ages pretty close. They're all J's.
And what's the first one?
Jared.
Jared.
Jared, okay. And then Robin and Terry have 2 girls, 9 and 8, and they're Taryn and Taylor. So I don't know why it seems to be the thing now, I guess, to name your children that way.
I know that you like to play golf, because we've played golf several times together. Are there any other sports or hobbies that you enjoy participating in or watching?
Well, golf is probably the sport that I've played the longest, and I don't play any better today than I did when I was 10 years old, but it's still a challenge. There was a period of time when I bowled in a church bowling league, and we had a good time. That was probably 10 years, and I still enjoy bowling. I just don't bowl very often, and I like to work outside, so that's most of my hobby now, is by just taking care of the house or the yard.
Okay. Tell us about any memberships of organizations, non-Masonic, that you have, or any other organizations that you're involved in, perhaps the church or...
Well, I joined the lodge right out of De Molay as soon as I was 21. And then, of course, I was active in the De Molay as an advisor for about 5 years. But when we got married, my focus kind of changed to family, and I kind of took a hiatus from the lodge for a while. And so there was about a 10-year period where we were pretty active in the church. I was a deacon for several years, and then I was a member of the session for several years. And so I was the chairman of the Board of Deacons for 3 years. During that time, we increased the number of deacons in our church from 30 to 60. And we developed a program that was called the Stewardship Program, which each deacon had about 6 families. And they visited those families. My best memory of that was the first time I went to visit each of my families. They were kind of hesitant to have us come in, and so we would come in and talk, everything. And when it was time to leave, they said, well, where's our pledge card? And I said, oh, this isn't part of any fundraiser, this isn't part of the normal program. And then they would all say, well, come back in and have a cup of coffee and a cookie. So it was a good program. And when you would see especially some of the widows in the church, they would say, he's my deacon, or he's my shepherd, and point that out to a couple of the other widows. And so it was a good feeling.
Masonic fraternity could learn from that.
Well, we kind of have in some respects. But
well, what church were you in?
It was the First Presbyterian Church in Lansing. That's the church that I was baptized in, and that's where my Sunday school experiences came from. And I taught Sunday school for a few years, both the 5th and 6th grade, and a couple of years in the senior high school. And senior high school was a little more of a challenge, because you had to find out there wasn't a set curriculum, so you had to find out really what the high school students wanted to talk about. Sometimes it was church related, and sometimes it was just very personal.
Very good. So you mentioned that your grandfather was a Mason. Is that how you first learned about the Masonic fraternity, or was it De Molay that first introduced you to the Masonic fraternity?
Well, it's a little bit of both. My grandfather always wore a Masonic ring. I knew he belonged to Lansing 33, and at one time I know he belonged to the Royal Archmasons, but during the Depression, he dropped his membership in the Royal Arch so he could keep his membership in the Blue Lodge. So I knew he was a Mason. I asked him about his ring several times, and he said, you'll learn about it later. So, that was always the kind of the carrot out in front. But then when I got into De Molay, I met some very good men as advisors, and we met. There were 2 lodge rooms in the Lansing Masonic Temple, and Walter French Lodge met in one lodge room, and the De Molay met in the other lodge room on the same Wednesday nights. So I met several members of Walter French Lodge, and so it was natural to join that lodge when I turned 21.
So since you gave me that tie-in, you mentioned the Walter French Junior High School and the Walter French Lodge. What did you learn about Walter French? I knew he was a Mason. I had no idea that he was that involved in the community.
Well, just that he was a leader. He was a teacher, a principal, and I think he was on the Board of Education at one time too, school board.
Okay. So you joined Walter French Lodge, and when was that?
That was, it's 1960.
Okay.
I joined the lodge, like I said, as soon as I turned 21, and so that was 1960.
And you said you took a hiatus for a few years. What got you back involved in the lodge?
Well, I had been thinking about going back to Walter French, but there had been a turnover quite a bit in the membership, and my father-in-law and brother-in-law were members in Okemos, and my brother-in-law was about to be installed as the Worshipful Master, and he asked me if I would consider being his chaplain. So we had enough time to make all the changes and get the transfer through, and so I became his chaplain.
So was that Jerry?
That was Jerry.
Jerry Blomquist?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. So
I think that was 1978 or 1979. So.
You became his chaplain, which obviously led you into greater involvement, and you got into the moving line.
Yes, I became the senior warden or senior deacon, and then went on through the rest of the line, and I was master in 1983.
1983, very good. So any recollections of your year as master, anything that sticks out of that time?
Well, one thing is I know it went by very quickly. That's probably the first foremost thing. It's how quick you prepare for it, and then it's over before you know it. And about the November meeting, you think, if I could do this a little longer, I could do a better job.
I think you're right. I know that you also have been very involved in Job's Daughters, and I'm assuming that's because of your involvement with your wife. But how did you get more active in Job's Daughters? I know that you went on and became Associate Grand Guardian. Tell us a little bit about that organization.
Well, part of it was certainly Ann's involvement as a member and my involvement in DMLA, but then when we were in Okemos Lodge, we have a third Saturday night chicken dinner, and when Robin was 12, we were at one of the chicken dinners, and the man who at the time was the Associate Guardian of the Bethel and Okemos came up to us and says, why isn't this young lady, well, she was 11, and said, why isn't this young lady in Job's Daughters? And Ann says, well, because she's not 12 yet, she has to be 12, and as soon as she gets to be 12, we have intentions of getting her into Bethel. And Jack said, well, it's 11 years old, she could join right now. So of course, that sped things up a little bit, and we went to all her meetings, and she eventually became honored queen, and we became more involved, and pretty soon Ann was a guardian, and I was associate guardian of the Bethel. And then the Bethels was struggling with membership, and the Lansing Bethel was struggling for membership, so they consolidated or merged. That was the first merger of any two Bethels in the state of Michigan, and as far as we know, in all of Job's Daughters. Wow. They had to write a special ceremony just to get the two Bethels together.
When was that?
Oh, I can't remember the date exactly, but it must have been 84, about 1984.
Okay. So how did you get involved then with the Grand Bethel?
Well, Ann was Grand Guardian in 1989, 88, 89, and she dragged me around from place to place. Actually, we did a lot together, and so when she started through the line, they start with the Grand Marshal. So she became Grand Guardian. One of the ladies in her group became Grand Guardian and asked me to be her Grand Chaplain. And so I was Grand Chaplain for a year, and then the next year I stood for Outer Guard. And in 4 years, 3 more years, you're the Associate Grand Guardian. That was 96, 97. The lady at the time was Jan Brown. She's now Jan Ward. And Beth Van Hamlin now was Beth Lewis at the time, and she was our Grand Bethel honored queen.
I know Beth. What other affiliated or appendant organizations are you involved with?
Well, I belong to the Scottish Rite and the Shrine. I joined those shortly after I became a Mason, and I more recently became active in the York Rite, with the Royal Arch, Royal and Select, and Commandery. I was Stan Simon's candidate for the Order of the Temple when he was the commander of Lansing Commandery number 25. So
very good. So have you been involved in leadership positions in any of the appendant bodies?
No, I haven't. I thought, well, it's just a personal thing, but probably because I come from a time when there were so many Masons, I've always felt that part of the reasons for the other organizations were for other people to be leaders.
I know that you have been an active member, though. I know that in you're a member of the Mummers in the Valley of Bay City.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Mummers?
Well, the Mummers are a group that take the non-speaking parts in the degree work of the Scottish Rite. And so you get to dress up in a costume and you get to do things and you'll kind of be an alter ego kind of a thing, but you don't have to learn any lines. However, some of the mummers are very good ritualists and do take part in that, but so far I just haven't. So.
In the shrine, I know that you have been very involved with the circus in the Lansing area.
Well, the circus in the Lansing area was not a shrine circus. Well, some people thought that it was, but it was an all-Masonic circus. The Caravan Youth Center, which was a group of Masons, and many of them were Shriners, sponsored for about 30 years the District Golden Gloves tournament in Lansing. And in the early 80s, boxing had kind of fallen out of favor, and the circus that had been sponsored since about 1936 by Lansing Commandery, the Commandery was being reduced in membership, and they could no longer handle the circus as one Masonic organization. So a group of people, again, part of the Caravan Youth Center, said, well, we'll sponsor the circus and make it an all-Masonic circus. So it involved about 26 lodges, Eastern Star chapters, Royal Arch, Royal and Select, and Commanderies, and the 3 youth groups in the greater Lansing area. And they all worked as volunteers, but each of their individual organizations got some money for each performance that they worked. So, and I was chairman of that for several years, 3 or 4 years in a row, and another year at another time. So we enjoyed that very much. But we had our last circus about 3 years ago.
Okay. So of all the affiliated and dependent organizations, which ones do you enjoy the most? Everybody has their favorite. Not that any of them are bad, but...
No. Well, I think the Scottish Rite Mummers is something that I'm enjoying more now. We're still involved with Job's Daughters, and I've become more involved with Rainbow. I'm on the state executive board for the Rainbow Girls. So I enjoy that. I enjoy the youth. I mean, they keep you young. I mean, so if you stay around young people, hopefully you still act and think young.
That's a good point. So I know over the years you've received many awards and honors. What are a couple of them that stick out?
Well, probably one would be the degree of Chevalier in DeMolay, and partly, like I said, when I was active, there were so many DeMolay that you couldn't aspire to something like that. So when I got a letter from the Supreme Council that said you've been nominated to receive that degree, I just couldn't believe it at first. And then, obviously, when you receive a telephone call from people that are at the Supreme Council for Scottish Rite, and they're all congratulating you for just being nominated for the 33rd degree, that leaves you speechless too. So.
Yes, it does. Tell us about some of the earliest Grand Masters that you've known personally.
Well, Russ Wells would be one. I knew Russ both as a Mason and as a executive officer for DeMolay, and I was on his state staff for a period of time. So Russ would be one, Russ Wells, that I probably know and respect a great deal for his work with the youth and his work in the Grand Lodge. And I think Dick Sands would be one that as an educated or an educator of Masonry, I marvel at his knowledge of Masonry and his willingness to share that with everyone. Don Boyer actually would be another one that I think of. Bob Osborne. I remember Bob Osborne more as the Grand Secretary maybe and as the Grand Master, but he had a great at Grand Lodge. He had a great command of the craft. Whenever he stepped to the podium, everybody listened.
That's true. Who were some of your Masonic mentors?
Well, there was a man in Walter French Lodge by the name of George Pierce, and he was the secretary of the lodge, and I just know that he was a mentor. And a man by the name of John Bell was a member of one of the other lodges in the Lansing area, and I believe he was a 33rd degree Mason. But he attended every lodge in the Lansing area, not just the 4 lodges that met in the Lansing Temple, but all the lodges. And whenever it was mentioned the sick and distressed, he took out his notebook and he wrote that person's name down, and sometime during the next week, he went to visit that person, whether he was a member of his lodge or whatever. And they had an honoring for him. And this is when I was probably first a Mason, and they had an honoring and a big dinner for him, and the gift they gave him was a set of 4 tires for his car. Because he wore out many sets of tires. So I remember him. And the memory I have of Masonry in general when I joined was the sense of immediate acceptance. I mean, I was 21, and here were these men, and I don't mean they were old, but they were 40, 45, and they took me at my word. They listened to me, respected my opinions, and that's a memory of Masonry that I hold very dear.
Absolutely. So, who were some of your mentors once you got to the Grand Lodge level? Who were some of the ones that showed you the ropes?
Well, I think Don Boyer, again, would be one. David Bedwell, Dale Edwards. They were all influential in getting me to run for the line in the first place, and they kind of guided me along the way. And then, of course, you become a family with the men that are ahead of you in the line, and then hopefully you become a mentor to those that are coming up behind you.
Exactly. So that leads me into my next question. What made you decide to run for Grand Lodge?
Well, I don't know. I don't say that it was like thrust upon me, but again, there were some people that encouraged me to join. To run. You know, I thought my leadership roles were only going to be confined to the youth groups, and that I had been the Associate Grand Guardian of Job's Daughters. I thought that was going to be the epitome of what I did in Masonry, or for Masonry. But some fellows asked me to consider it, and I considered it off right up until the last minute, to be honest, when I agreed to run.
Because you were nominated off the floor.
I was nominated off the floor. I did not send out flyers, and my lodge did not officially sponsor me ahead of time. I was nominated off the floor.
And who were you Grand Marshal for?
I was Grand Marshal for David Fluke. Okay. And then that was the time when Bob McClellan was the senior Grand Warden, and he passed away the day after Grand Lodge. So several weeks into my term as Grand Marshal, I became the junior Grand Deacon, but I still carried on some of the responsibilities of Grand Marshal.
When you were going through the Grand Lodge line, what surprised you? What did you just say, man, I had no idea?
Well, I'm not too sure. I mean, I just kind of grew. I sat next to Jim Shadd a lot, and he's now Grand Tyler Emeritus, but he whispered very good counsel in my ear, that you're here to learn and to listen, and kind of like a child, only speak when spoken to. So I kind of learned that there was an expected, behavior. Maybe that's the way to put it. So you learned as you progressed.
So you worked your way through the line, you became Grand Master in 2004. What were some of the highlights of your year as Grand Master?
Well, I think one of the highlights was the acceptance of the program that Bob Conley had, the renewal program. During that year, we hired him as the director of renewal and developed a 5-year program for renewal, which the lodges are still, it's remodeled some, but are still following that basic tenet and principle regarding growth and retention. So that was probably one of the highlights. We also, as you know, we had a couple other items dealing with the Masonic home and whether or not we would sell the Masonic home or continue to keep it, and a couple other things. So those were a couple things that kind of we focused on that year.
I remember the Grand Master made me the chairman of that committee. So, what do you think the fraternity has to do to grow and prosper?
Well, I think it needs to be as open as it can be possibly with the public, that it needs to continue to do things in the public eye, whether it's things like the Michigan CHIP program or other programs that we have. I think, well, just being more open, being willing to talk to your friends about Masonry. I mean, most of us wear a ring. We could always initiate a conversation with a friend that we thought would be a good Mason. I think we should, those of us who are older should focus on those who are younger in that regard.
Be a mentor.
Mm-hmm.
So, actually, following right along with that question is, what would you tell somebody that was thinking about becoming a Mason? What advice would you give them? What would you tell them to think about before they joined?
Well, first of all, I would tell them it would be the greatest experience in their life, short of marriage and your children. But certainly that would rank the third highest thing for most of us, I think, would be the fraternity. That I would tell them that they would find friends anywhere in the world, that they would never be alone unless they chose to be alone, that they would find friends that would last a lifetime.
It's true. Along those same lines, what advice would you give to a man who was about to become Worshipful Master of his lodge for the first time?
Well, first of all, when you become Worshipful Master, it seems like all of a sudden all the responsibility is yours. So, kind of be ready for that, because the craft is waiting for you to be the leader. You've been the senior warden or the junior warden, and you've watched the man ahead of you, but you have to realize that the craft expects that person to be the leader. They don't want to, I don't think that they want to make a lot of decisions. I think they want the leader to say, this is what we're going to do, this is the direction we're going to go. I know in my own lodge, we had a group of past masters, and they said that their job was to make the current Grand Master look good. In other words, they didn't try to run the show from the sidelines.
Very good. So, following that same line of questioning, what advice would you give somebody that came to you and said, I'm thinking about running for Grand Lodge?
I'd say it'd be one of the greatest experiences of your life. Depending on the individual, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but some people would be a better fit as a Grand Lodge officer than others. There are some who think that it would be a great office, and it is, but I'm not sure that they would be cut out to be that. So the most difficult part would be to guide them to not run. But most men who choose to run are good men, and so I would encourage them to do what I did, sit and listen for a while.
It's good advice. How has Masonry impacted your life?
Oh, I don't know if I can begin to put that into words. I don't know what I would have done without Masonry. I mean, one of the programs since I retired was the Beacon project started back in Bob Conley's year. And then that's been in existence for 13 years. Both Ann and I have volunteered in that program for 13 years. And it's the most rewarding thing I think that I've done, working with kids in the 3rd grade and helping them grow. So I don't know beyond that what I would say. I mean, it's just, I don't know what I would have done without Masonry.
It's a huge part of your life, I know.
I'm sure other things would have taken up time. I probably would have been involved with the church. Maybe I would have been more involved in politics or the community in some way, some public board. But I don't think I would have the same feeling of reward.
I think I know what you mean. So any final reflections on the fraternity or anything you want to say?
Well, just that I think it's the greatest organization for men in the world. I've had an opportunity to travel. I've been to Scotland, to England, been to Italy. Italy was one of the best trips that I never expected to see the Leaning Tower, the Colosseum. Those things were all things I read about in the history books. If it hadn't been for Masonry, never would have seen that. Never would have gone to the place where my grandfather was raised in Aberdeen and seen his name in their ledger book. I mean, those are all things that just happened because I was a Mason.
And I was on some of those trips with you.
Yes.
They were great trips.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, on behalf of the Charitable Foundation, we appreciate your participation in our Legacy Series. And we want to thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
It's pleasure's ours.